In anticipation of the new cycling season, I spent the whole winter planning the routes of future trips. I decided not to ride overnight, limiting myself to daylight trips. As a result, I had options for every taste, in big cities, on country roads, and in the forest wilderness. The latter was always especially enticing. I scrutinized the maps, and my attention was drawn to a large wooded area to the southeast of the city. Compared to the other directions, this area seemed truly wild. The maps showed that there were dirt roads in the forest, and the detailed site plan intrigued me even more. All of a sudden, in the middle of the forest, dirt roads could turn into asphalt roads. After a few hundred meters, the asphalt would disappear again. That's unusual. Digging deeper, I found many legends about this place. They say that there used to be prosperous villages here, but they were all deserted in the middle of the XX century. They were resettled to conduct some military tests, and then they started to bury nuclear waste in the forest. Yes, it's not the most cheerful place. I don't know if I believed everything I read, but I put a trip to the curious forest on the schedule. I planned to get from door to door in 14 hours, taking into account all the stops and anticipating difficulties in orienteering. The night before the trip, I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares. It was dark all around. I was in some old abandoned bunker. I was trying to run away from someone, but I couldn't move. And scary, invisible monsters were closer and closer. A bony pale hand appeared out of the darkness. It reached for my back and tried to grab my shirt. The alarm clock rang. The story of this forest scared me after all. Staggering a little, I got out of bed and went to brush my teeth. In the mirror, a sleepy, broken face. Yeah, I'd better be a little more awake for such grand plans. But we have what we have. I washed my face and felt better. Took a pre-prepared backpack with everything necessary. First aid kit for the bike. Spare camera, pump, set of keys. The first aid kit for the man stayed at home. I'm quite confident in myself. Sandwiches, water, hiking romance. I set off, and in an hour I found myself at the border of the cherished forest. It is easy to get here from the city. Just cross 2 highways, a railroad, and a river. A brook flowed out of the forest, gurgling and shimmering in the May sunshine, and a well-trodden path stretched along it. Perhaps I should follow it. I entered the forest and found myself as if in another world. The crowns were closing in, and it was dark all around. The old spruces were covered with moss. The aspens were climbing in columns. The hazels completed the gloomy picture and did not allow to see anything further than 20 meters. All in all, the forest was like a forest. I looked back and surveyed the field I had come across. Solid sprouts of wheat were waving under the blue sky. I took a deep and relaxed breath and began to pedal leisurely. The trail was surprisingly good. You could see that it was being walked regularly. I wasn't the only one who had figured out to explore this forest. The only thing that indicated that the road was unused was the occasional fallen tree along it. And there was clearly no one to clean it up. I was climbing over another tree and looked at a sprawling flowering bush, when suddenly I heard a sharp rustling just a few meters behind me. It was as if someone had been following me all this time, and now that I was distracted, decided to run up and pounce from behind. I turned around quickly. No one. Admittedly, I was a little scared. In the middle of the woods, all the sudden sounds make you tense up. Suddenly, there was that sound again, now from the other side. I turned back around, and there was no one there again. The same tingling in my stomach and heels began, appearing on the edge between bewilderment and fear. The rustling again, as if even closer. There was only one option left. I slowly raised my head. There was a kestrel's nest in a tree hanging over the road. It's a bird of prey. When it saw that it had been uncovered, it let out a loud cry. I don't speak bird language, but I understood the phrase. Get out. The fear hadn't fully let go yet, but I had already continued pedaling and thinking. Why was I so scared? What did I expect to see behind me? A crazed maniac. A chupacabra. Yes, after all, nature awakens in us some hidden wild feelings. A sense of insecurity, if you will. A huge bear or a lion could burst into the cave of our ancestors at any moment and tear everything and everyone to shreds. People lived with this stomach-sucking sense of fear all their lives. Got used to it. Just like now, miners go down into the mines every shift, knowing how many of their comrades were forever buried beneath their feet. Each of them knows they could be next, but they just go on living, keeping this knowledge somewhere in the depths of their. I was pulled out of my thoughts by the changing landscape. It's lighter. The forest is as dense as it was, but the branches are no longer overhanging my head. There is only clear sky, and the asphalt road began. That's the one. Perfectly smooth asphalt in the middle of the forest. Why did they put it here? I'm going to find out. But the happiness didn't last long. After a few hundred meters, the asphalt predictably ended, leading to a gap between the trees. I decided to look around and fasten my bike with the lock to a tree. Force of habit. I went to the light and saw a wonderful picture. A big clean pond and an apple orchard in bloom. The smell was incredible. There were even fish splashing in the pond. This must have been one of the forgotten villages. I wish it were September. I would have loved a juicy apple. I enjoyed the view for about 5 minutes until I was distracted by the sound of a bicycle falling. Probably a sign that it was time to move on. As I approached the bike, I stopped a few meters away from it. It was as if the surroundings hinted that it hadn't fallen by itself. But I couldn't figure out by what exactly. Yes, that's right. The seat's torn. I heard the familiar rustling again. A bird must have landed on the bike. Do birds growl? I looked around and screamed in terror. There was a man standing almost right next to me. He had an absolutely glassy stare, looking as if through me. His mouth was set in an animalistic grin. His clothes were all tattered, with traces of earth. On his gaunt face and hands were sores and signs of decomposition. He was breathing loudly and growling. Terrified, I jumped away from him and fell to the ground. Getting up, I began to walk slowly backward without turning my back to him. The man looked up and let out a loud growl that turned into a scream, like a wolf howling at the moon. I couldn't see anything further. I was running. After running half a kilometer, I saw a large spreading oak on the edge of the forest and instantly flew to the top. My heart was pounding frantically. Was he chasing me or not? After I caught my breath, I hung down from the branch and looked around. No one seemed to be around. But what was it? A crazed maniac? A chupacabra? No, he was clearly not of this world. Especially horrifying was his pale body with traces of decomposition. It was as if he had crawled out of the grave. I was distracted from my thoughts by a growl. Someone was walking under the tree. Carefully looking down, I saw a man waddling awkwardly on the ground and looking around. It was also the living dead, but clearly different. He hadn't realized to look up, and the growling began to drift away. He didn't seem to notice me, which is good news. There are several of them here. That's the bad news. Sitting on a tree branch, looking at the young leaves swaying in the light breeze, I thought about what to do next. There was one obvious option: run to the bike and screw out of here as fast as possible. But that's very risky. First of all, the bike is strapped on, and I'm wasting time fighting the lock anyway. Secondly, I can't see it from here. If I run to the bike, I run the risk of running into a crowd of the living dead who are hurting it waiting for its owner. Third, I know too little about the enemy. Are they fast? Are they smart? What do they want to do to me? What I certainly didn't want to do was wait here until night. In the daytime, good visibility gives at least the illusion of safety. I decided to scout around carefully and see if anyone was near the bike. On the basis of this information, I would decide what to do next. Carefully looking around, I slowly descended from the oak tree, and then, ducking down, carefully walked toward the bike. I passed the pond, where the fish were still splashing, and the apple orchard, shimmering in the glare of the sun. I had walked most of the way, and the bicycle was about to appear from behind the bushes, but I was not to see it. Last year's leaves crunched treacherously under my foot. There was a terrible roar and a loud stomping sound. As I stood up to my full height, I saw 4 or 5 people running at me. It was all of them, rotting alive, in tattered white coats covered in earth and blood. One of them had goggles on his face, another had a yellow helmet on his head. They looked like scientists, employees of some laboratory. I was reminded of stories of weapons testing and nuclear waste. These people must have been victims of some cruel experiment or just died in an accident. Or rather, not dead. The thought didn't stay in my head. My legs were already carrying me in the opposite direction of the bike. A scream came out of my mouth. What was it for? To inform all the living dead of this forest that there was a dinner party. I was completely out of control. The sun had set behind a cloud, plunging the whole neighborhood into semi-darkness. I ran out into a wide clearing, covered with thick grass taller than I was. The glade was covered with paths that formed a real maze. In a panic, I began to dash through its blind turns, finally losing my orientation in space. A loud growling sounded from behind and from the side. My heart wasn't holding in my chest, and my lungs were burning with fire. Suddenly, the grass parted, and I found myself in the center of the clearing. I looked around. There was tall grass all around me, a ring of dense forest on the horizon, and under my feet was an iron hatch that looked like the entrance to some kind of bunker. A bunker. An abandoned bunker. Bony, pale hands. I realized everything, breathed in and out slowly, and sat on all fours, fangs sinking into his neck. The alarm clock rang. I had never felt so relieved after a nightmare. In the mirror, a sleepy, broken but peaceful face. My neck is a little sore, but it doesn't matter because it's July outside and I have a wonderful trip ahead of me. This story happened to me a couple of years ago. It was a warm summer evening. The sun had already slipped towards sunset, and a pleasant summer twilight had set in. Grasshoppers were chirping merrily under the windows, and young people and local cats were lazily strolling along the paths of the neighborhood. Everything around breathed calm and measured. All around, but not in my and my husband's apartment. As it often happens, we fought with him about nothing and from nothing. In one far from beautiful moment, my husband had the indiscretion to say something that even in a fit of anger, it is better not to mention. Resentment overshadowed reason and feelings, and I, throwing something light on my shoulders and shoving the phone in my pocket, jumped out into the street. My hand fumbled for my car keys in the pocket of my cardigan, and the decision came by itself, to drive a little air and calm down. Turning on some light music in the car, I drove out of the city towards the village, which was about 60 kilometers away from us. Having smoked a couple of cigarettes and drained my tears, I realized that the resentment was replaced by elementary anger. The phone was silent. My husband was not interested in where I was and what was happening to me. Anger at my husband forced me to make a decision, which I regretted very much later. About halfway to the village on the road to the side of the road is not remarkable turn, which led to a small swampy lake in the depths of the forest. This road, and I decided to turn and there on the shore to spend the night disconnecting the phone. Let my husband worry. So I thought at that moment, and it seemed to me that it was very reasonable and right. Having parked the car and smoked another cigarette, I began to lay down for the night on the back seat. There was a thin plaid and a small decorative cushion. I made myself comfortable and turned off my phone, which was still silent, and dozed off. I was awakened by a sharp sound like a bang. In my sleep, I didn't realize what it was, and I got up and looked at the darkness. Despite the summer night, it was pretty dark, and I couldn't see very well. Deciding that I had dreamed it, I tried to get back to sleep as I heard the sound again, an unpleasant clap, like a palm hitting the car. Checking in a panic, and making sure all the doors were closed and seeing no one near the car, I started to climb from the back seat to the front seat to turn on the headlights and start the car. At that moment, when I was climbing over and heard this terrible sound, a sound like someone scratched metal with a fork or knife, in general with something metal. I realized that it's nearby and scratching my car, but there is no one. Having switched on the headlights of high beam, I started trying to start the car. I managed to do it, despite the fact that the car is absolutely new. It was not even a year since the purchase in the car dealership at that time, not immediately. In tears, with wildly shaking hands, my whole life in front of my eyes, I was rushing along the road without understanding. Having rushed home in hysterics, tried to explain to my husband, who was already alarmed by my absence, what happened to me in the forest. He, as a man sensible and rational, tried to find a logical explanation for what happened, but having found in the morning a huge scratch on the side of the car, as if a nail scratched the paint along with the primer, ate with sufficient force. Skepticism in it was reduced. I still do not know what it was. The scratch has already been fixed, but the memories have not gone anywhere. They are still with me. Since then, I cannot be lured into the forest for a picnic or for mushrooms and berries, although I used to love it all and went with pleasure.